One of the funnier stories I have in my career is early on when I was still an analyst, I was working on a presentation for all of our leadership in the investment bank at Morgan Stanley. And one of the last items was to distribute the materials, which back in that day was not done through computers. It was not done through the normal means that we all think about today. It was actually typically either hand or distributed by fax. And we had a little bit of a late start to completing the materials. And so one of the leaders was on his way to Europe and taking the overnight flight from JFK. And about 8:30, I realized there's no way we're going to get this material completed and in his hands before he leaves for the airport. So about 9 o'clock, we're close to finished. At 9:15, we're right on the cut line of whether I can get it to him at the airport before he takes off. And they put a car together and get me in a car at about 9:30. And I'm literally riding from Midtown Manhattan with these materials in hand. About halfway there, I realized I have no idea what this person looks like. Luckily, I did have a phone. I called back to the office and I said, Steve, what does Joe look like? And he literally says to me, I can't really describe him without giving you a number of things that you'll need to look for, but he's going to be in the lounge at JFK. His plane takes off at 10:40, and all you need to do is just get to the lounge. Well, getting to the lounge was more of a challenge than you might imagine, but I finally did get to the lounge, and he finally gave me just enough description that I could actually figure out who it was. And then I realized he has no idea who I am. So it's a two-part issue. And so as I'm walking through the lounge, looking for all these people who look exactly the same. So imagine in the 1990s, an American Airlines lounge filled with men in their 50s, unfortunately at the time, most of whom looked pretty similar and all of whom were dressed exactly the same. So I finally looked around and I figured this person has to be the person, just fits enough of the description that I was given. I walk up to the man and I said, Mr. Fogg, because I was young enough at the time to actually talk about him in Mr. and Mrs. terms. And he said, no, my name is Joe. I said, Joe, I'm Bryan. I don't know if they told you, but I'm bringing in materials for the meeting that you'll have when you arrive in London in the morning. And he looks at me and gives me kind of an up and down. He says, you made it. That's all he said. I give him the materials and I walk out of the lounge and get back to the office. But what it does kind of paint for me is this picture of you never know what the job is going to entail. You often assume a lot about what's going to happen, but the majority of what really happens at the edges is often what really matters. And I think for me, it was just an interesting example of you got to know who your audience is. You got to understand what the parameters are in terms of getting things completed on time. And my assumption was that everybody's going to be in the meeting in person the next day, or I was simply going to be faxing materials. Of course, it was legal-sized paper, which made it that much more difficult. So they insisted that I get it there in person. So it did teach me that you can make anything happen. Getting in that car and on the way to JFK late on a Sunday night, I wasn't exactly sure whether I'd make it or not. But you give it 100% and you do everything you can to make it happen. And most of the time, if you really, truly give 100%, it really does happen.
I love it. Though it really makes me grateful for like email attachments, PDFs.
Yes, it does.
But you could have done it 8 hours later and you would have gotten it on the plane.
Yeah, it's interesting how life happens. And what I find is that rarely do things come together in the plan you expect. Even when you plan and plan and plan, which obviously most of us do a pretty good job of, there's always the unexpected. And the unexpected is what you have to expect. And that did teach me a lesson pretty early on that, you really have to understand what the end game really is completely. And the end game wasn't just getting materials ready to distribute. It was actually getting it in people's hands and knowing where they're going to be. So certainly from that point on, I made sure I understood who was going to receive what and when and where they were going to be, because I found the logistics and became a big part of the job sometimes.
There are two things I really love about this story. I think, especially when you work for a large corporate, everything is process, right? And people love process. Everything is structured and you understand the job description, you understand what you need to do, you understand how things are like, what's the approval process, and so on and so forth. So sometimes you're losing the muscle of just improvising and just getting the shit, because in order to do things, and it happens no matter where you are, right? You need to improvise. That's an extreme case of improvisation. So it's a great story. But I think it's basically a muscle. It's almost a skill that we need to work on in order to excel in whatever we do, because not everything will be scripted. Not everything will be by the rules. And usually the extraordinary things will happen in similar stories. And number two is like, I really like the getting shit done. Like, I don't care. I just need to get it there, even if I need to book the plane ticket and sit next to the dude, which was.
Yeah, it's interesting because this idea of get shit done, make it happen. The end game is what matters. So it's easy to say he's in the lounge. He's already left for the airport. But you can make yourself comfortable with being an inch short, a yard short, not getting it quite over the end zone. But the reality is, if you really want to make a difference and you really want to be known for something at the top of the game, it's that extra piece. It's the end zone is the distribution of the materials is physically in the person's hands that they need it. So whatever the game is that you're playing, whatever the end zone is the end zone. It's not an inch short. It's not a yard short. I watch a lot of sports. So I play enough sports and watch enough sports to use analogies of all types. But the reality is the way in which you distribute your time is never the way you expect it to be. It's not just completing the materials. It's somebody has to make a decision. Something is an outcome from the work you do. And if you don't get to the end zone, then you don't get the answer. And you certainly won't get the answer you need or want if you don't go the extra mile.
I always just love this question about what is that thing, that program, that project, that success where looking back, you're still extremely proud. So go ahead and show off for us.
Interesting part about my background is I did a lot of systems work early in my career, not by choice. Most of the time, it was sort of a forced entry point. We were in the midst of a global implementation of a business software called PeopleSoft, which was pretty common in the 90s. Almost every major organization put that in. Initially, they were an HR system, but they became an enterprise system with finance and other things as well. And our implementation was not going particularly well. And we had spent $10 million and had not yet been able to put the system in. And even for a large enterprise like Morgan Stanley at the time, that was a lot of money. And certainly for an HR function, that was an extraordinary amount of money. And I was the global HR leader for operations, which was our back office for all of our trading platforms, which I was actually really enjoying. It was actually one of my more interesting jobs. There's a transformation of the whole back office function, bringing it sort of into the modern age. I got a call from the head of HR at the time, and I was told that my next assignment was happening and I was going to be leading this PeopleSoft project. And my first thought was, I've only been in this job 18 months. I'm not really ready for that. You told me I had to take this assignment, which I did, happily in a lot of ways, but now I'm enjoying it. And the global leader for ops and technology had already been told that this was going to happen. And I said, no, I'm not ready. I really want to do this. We were about to go through a merger with Deanwood Discover at the time. And I said, let me just kind of keep my head down here. I'm really enjoying this. And he said, no, talk to David, who was the head of ops and technology first, and then, come back to me with a real answer. So I said, okay. I went in. I'll never forget, he is the former trading head for one of the business units and now was head of ops and tech. So he knew the business really well and obviously was helping to drive the globalization of the back office functions. And I walked in his office. He had both feet up on the desk and one shoe literally looked like it had worn through because I think I was looking at his sock on one foot. And I thought, gosh, I know this guy makes a lot of money. I work in HR, so I know pretty much what everybody makes here. And he's got shoes that are worn down to the socks. So that was my first thought, which is interesting. But then my next thought was, it makes sense because he's actually spending money that doesn't make money unless it's spent well on ops and tech. And his first thing he said to me was, Bryan, it's great to meet you. I understand you're going to go and fix this problem we've got. And I thought, that's an interesting way for him to position it. He really didn't ask me anything, really just kind of opened it up with a statement that was already a foregone conclusion of what was going to happen next. So I literally said to him, yeah, I'm really not sure. And Lisa worked for him as the head of ops. I've had a really good plan for what we're trying to do to globalize operations. He said, got it. I said, oh, okay. He said, but your next assignment is going to be this fix-it problem, right? And I said, sounds like it. And Larry looked at him and said, I guess we know what's going to happen next. He said, yeah, we got to figure it out. Don't worry. We've got your next step. We've got the next step behind you. We already talked to Lisa and we've got this done. I said, great. How long do you need me for? He said, well, when you finish this job, when you finish this conversation, you can walk back to Liz and Liz is going to just put you in this job tomorrow. So it was one of these things where I learned that when things are going to happen in an organization, things are going to happen in an organization. And it actually dovetails well with my book as well, which we can talk about in a bit. But it was one of these things where stretch assignments are oftentimes what you put people into a qualified. But when things need to be fixed, and you put your best people in it no matter what. And at the time, as much as I felt like I was in a particular job that was critical, the organization as a whole was literally making a sacrifice in that world to put me in an opportunity which did actually need somebody that understood the business of HR and who would be practical on how to do it. And so literally the next day I was in the new assignment and I had a new boss and off I went. And so, for me, one of the interesting things about life is you don't get to choose everything. You put yourself in positions where things can happen, and then you just let some of those things play out. And I trusted the organization, I trusted the people, and the people in that organization at the leadership level knew the right things to do. And when it came down to you got to fix something, it is going to be just all hands on deck, and you take your best people and you just make the decisions, which also made it easier for me in life to go through the rest of my career, understanding that you got to bite the bullet sometimes. You take tough decisions along the way. And it was tough for them to move me out. David was actually losing me from his organization, and his leadership team did not want that. They were basically saying, no, this doesn't make any sense. We're in the midst of a major transformation. He's the architect of a lot of it, meaning me. We can't lose him. And those conversations had already been had by the time I got to David's office. Those decisions had been made. And there wasn't really a choice for me. It was going to be, you're moving on to the next thing. It's the right thing to do. And at the leadership level, everybody had already made that decision. So, it's interesting the twists and turns careers take, but it actually was terrific for me. It was great for the organization. We were able to put the new software in within 18 months. We took a major setback in the planning process. We reassembled a new team. And I put together a much simpler plan of action, and we made it happen. Similar to my story about getting to the airport, we were going to get to the end zone, and we were going to figure out a way to get this done, and we had a time frame, and we were going to meet that time frame, which we did. It's a global implementation that was all over the world over that next 18 months, but a lot of sacrifices were made. People wanted this, they wanted that. And in the end, we said, no, this is the software. This is what we're going to do. This is the process we're going to have. And we just got it done. And sometimes that's just the way it's got to be.
I think there are a lot of great learnings here. I'm curious about the link and the connection to your book, actually, because we just started with that. Usually, most people I met who wrote a book, it's kind of like a pattern that you recognize, that you follow, that it's kind of like a thread that connects everything you did, and it happens over and over again. Then you come up with a concept and then give it a lot of examples, but with just one concept, right? Can you tell us a bit about like the main concept of the book and then connect it back to what you did in that instance? Because I think I assume it's connected.
The book's focus is that what really matters is retention. And there are a number of mainstays that organizations must follow, must follow in order to be successful at retaining people. And we always talk about retaining the best people, but organizations need to retain their people, and they should get the right people to begin with. And so retaining your best people isn't really the end game. It's retaining your people. You should be aspiring to have the best people. And therefore, once you have the best people, it is obviously your job to retain them. And in what really matters, I've got 10 main attributes that companies and leaders in particular must follow in order to retain. And sure, people say, well, I do those things. Well, do you do all 10? Do you do them consistently? Do you follow it as if that's the most important thing? Is the end zone having 5% or less retention, or is it acceptable to have industry retention rates? Is it acceptable to have X or Y as an outcome? And the answer for most people is, yeah, it's, we're within a zone. Well, what's the zone? I mean, the zone is the end zone. There's not like a middle zone. There's not like a beginning zone. There's an end zone. You have to be there. What's happened with organizations, and having sat with boards of directors and having sat with executives over a number of years in different organizations, what's driven this issue to be a problem is that organizations are measured on so many metrics. So leaders today, and it's driven by boards, it's driven by shareholder transparency. If transparency is a goal for shareholders, the way that boards have made that happen is they've actually divvied up scorecards. They call them balanced scorecards. Well, the balanced scorecard has 74 metrics. That's the terminology that I use. Well, who can measure 74 things and be good at it? Most of us are lucky to remember 3 or 4 and get focused on it. But if you think about 74 metrics, and maybe it's 26 for some organizations, maybe it's 13 for others, you're dividing up your time in small percentage increments. So let's take a simple example and say there's 25 metrics on the scorecards. So you're spending 4% of your time. Well, let's imagine you're an executive that has 60 hours of time against those 25 metrics. Well, how much time are you spending on each one? Do you actually spend just an hour or 2 a day, or an hour or 2 a week, or an hour or 2 a month on some of those? Or do you actually divvy up your time in percentage terms because that's how you're paid? That shouldn't be the question that you're trying to answer. You know what your outcome is as an organization. You're trying to be the best in your business. Well, if you're not retaining your people, whatever you spend your time on won't matter. And a lot of organizations get to the point of saying, well, best in class turnover is 14.5% in my industry. Well, that means you're losing 1.5 of your 10 people every year. How do you have 14.5% turnover as your turnover rate? It just seems like a ridiculous number. So the goal of the book is to try to get people to understand that you have to manage to a really low retention turnover number and really high retention number, or all those other metrics, whether it's 25, 74, 13, won't matter. And that if you get your retention number right, whatever that hill is you're trying to climb, whatever that mountain is that you've got to get over, you'll find a way to make it happen. But you won't find a way to make it happen if you're managing to best-in-class industry turnover rates. You've got to get your turnover rate down to under 5%. The reason I use 5% is it's about the lowest number that I've seen attainable in organizations. But more importantly, it's a number that most organizations can most likely manage to, which is roughly 1 in 20 people, obviously, leaving per year. And that includes turnover that might be people moving out of the organization into another part of the organization. And I think that's the other thing that people say, well, yeah, we manage to a certain level of retention, but we also manage to a certain level in which we move people around the organization. You got to take all of that into account, because good teams can't become great at what they do if those people are constantly turning over. And the cost of turnover, which I talk a little bit about in the book as well, is way beyond what they talk about relative to it's 6 months of somebody's salary. Well, that's the percentage of time that maybe it takes to find somebody. But to bring somebody into an organization, especially as they get more senior, and really inculcate them into a culture, get them to understand how all the departments work, how the competition really thinks about what we do, with the products that we have within the organization, the products we're thinking about, the marketing plans, the branding, all of that ecosystem that is an organization. That's not something that happens in 3 months or 6 months or even a year. It often takes multiple years to really get there. And so the cost of retention goes way beyond the current way in which we measure it. And the industry data we have today that tells us that 10% or 12% or 14.5% is an okay number to get to is off by a multiple. And so the major part of the book is to try to get leaders to understand those 10 key attributes they should focus on, but also some stories about the differences between companies that have done really well in retention and those that have not, and really gives people an opportunity to think about the way in which they practice what they do.
I think it's the first time, you hear a lot about retention, but what I like about it, it's the first time someone really puts it like in the front of the stage. Like that's the number one metric. And regardless if I don't think there is an absolute truth, regardless if it's like true or not, I think it's interesting for sure. Like it made me think. By the way, our OKR for retention is 5%. So without reading your book, so I think we're specifically aligned. I wonder if you look only at voluntary attrition, or also when you're forced, like a lot of companies are reducing headcount, like it happens nowadays, like the biggest companies in the world. How do you look at basically involuntary attrition, or like when you decide to part ways with employees, do you need to like reduce this number, or are you just talking about let's make sure that the people the company want to keep are actually staying?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there's a lot of focus on this idea of voluntary versus involuntary turnover. But if you think about it just as an organizational impact, whether it's involuntary or voluntary, there's an organizational impact. You can argue maybe at the margin that involuntary turnover, based on the fact that that person's probably not performing as well or other attributes, maybe the impact is not as good. But turnover is turnover. When somebody leaves an organization, you have to replace them, typically, unless you've got obviously a volume reduction, which in that case, it's a different issue. But let's say that it's a stable organization that's maybe at the margin growing, staying competitive. Any percentage turnover more than 5, regardless of why, is destabilizing to the organization. Now, the reason why somebody might be an involuntary termination beyond the volume-related metrics could be that they're not meeting expectations, they don't have the skill set, et cetera. But organizations need to step back and say, why did that happen? And stop that from happening. So it's easy to get lulled into sleep and start measuring different ways. It's 5%. When you're on a football field at the end of the game, when you look up at the scoreboard, they say, well, we got within 5% of the end zone. You know how many points you get for that? 0. And so it's really easy to get comfortable. And HR executives do this with the metrics all the time. They parse it. That's fine. Parsing it makes sense. Understand why that turnover rate for involuntary or for people in category A or B or C is happening, and then work at why that is and stop it. The goal doesn't change. Maybe you have other reasons that you need to make adjustments to something in your hiring process. Or maybe there's something else you need to do in terms of skill development in the learning space. So it's easy to get comfortable with measuring things and just sort of throwing out there the excuse or the reasons why. But the excuse or the reasons why have to be not justified, but managed. And so in the end, what I want to do is have managers realize that the end game is 5%. That's the end zone you're trying to get to. The reasons why you have turnover greater than 5%, you have to understand, and you have to attack each of those different reasons differently. Some might be recruiting, as I said. You got to do the right job up front. Some might be skill development. Some might be organizational planning for the long term. What are you doing about your 5 and 10-year plan? Why are people becoming obsolete from a skill set standpoint 3 or 4 or 5 years in? So there's many reasons why it may be what it is, but each of those must be attacked, not justified.
What I love about your premise is it's a completely different mentality than what you see today. Right now, there's sort of a management mentality that we can find someone else, everyone is replaceable. But what you're saying is actually, no, find the right people and invest in them, double down and build them with you so that you lose the institutional knowledge. You don't waste time. You create real teams that can actually drive the long-term impact. I love that because I think most people, especially now, millennials and alphas, as they're coming up, I don't think they expect to stay anywhere more than a year or two because they're seen as disposable. They feel disposable and they're not committed to where they are because it's not two-sided. But when you have someone who says, we want to invest in you, when we hire you, we're taking you in for the long term, there's no more company man. It's very unusual. So if there is that mentality shift to say, no, if you want to be here, we will, create the best workforce. You will be part of something bigger than yourself and you'll love it. I think people will commit as well. It'll be, once that commitment comes from the management, it'll come from the workforce as well. So I love that.
And a lot of it does come down to hiring the right people. So a lot of companies today do like the idea of hiring multi-generational workforce, which is great. Important for us in the long term to have that ability to have multi-generational skills, knowledge, capabilities, understandings, et cetera. But hire people with the idea that they're going to be there for the long term and invest in them up front. If you're hiring lots of people who do decide to leave, why are they leaving? It's again, don't get comfortable with things being status quo or a certain way, or that's how it is across the industry. The minute you get comfortable with that, you're not going to be best in class. You have to flip the script and say, how do I become or stay best in class? And it starts with your people. And that ability and agility to shift over time. isn't with people who turn over constantly. It's people who are committed, who've been part of your organization, who understand what the up cycles are and what the down cycles are, who understand the competition, the shifts in competition, the product mix. That does not happen quickly. And you can't learn that overnight. You might come from the industry and understand broadly what that company may be good at when you're joining them, but you really don't understand the secret sauce. There is a secret sauce to every organization, and really understanding that is something that typically takes years to truly appreciate all the way through.
And one more thing, just to add on top of it, I think if we go even one step higher, like you think about IP of companies, like think of OpenAI, right? If the executive team of OpenAI moves to another company, it's not OpenAI anymore. The other company is. So when you think about, okay, companies are basically their people, right? Like their future is their people, probably their present is their people. And then talent, if talent equals IP, and then you say, okay, how do I get the best talent? If I get the best talent, I win. And then you can do two things. Like you can hire the best talent, actually three things. You can hire the best talent, but this is a very hard task, right? Because Go will compete with Google. The second thing you can do, like subject to the talent that you hired or already have, is to retain them to make sure they're not living elsewhere. And the third thing probably is, how do I make my talent better? Like the given talent, how do I, like you said, build the skills? So I think it's kind of like a triangle between how do I do the best recruiting, the best retention, and the best development in order to really get it right. But I agree with you that if you need to pick one metric and assume that you cannot really win the recruiting, like the recruiting game, and then if you just focus on retention, it's a very interesting approach.
Well, retention to me is the highest level order. The learning and development piece, all aspects of recruiting fall underneath it. So if you've got a goal on retention, you have to always go back to the tributaries that get you there, one of which is hiring the right people. And we talk about the best people, but it's the right people. Whether you want to invest in developing them is a question some organizations have. Some prefer to hire people that are more mature in their careers. Others would prefer to develop them early on. It's probably not, for most organizations, either or. It's probably some combination. But if you think about retention as the highest order of achievement, all the other processes, practices must fall underneath there and support that higher retention. And so, in the book, I talk about the importance of getting talent acquisition right at the get-go, making sure you focus on development and careers. So there's a number of aspects, but they all fall underneath and must support the greater goal of higher retention.
All right, that leads me to, we'll jump around. That leads me to my skill question. All right, let's talk about specifically for HR teams. I don't think it matters whether you're focused on acquisition or development. I think any aspect of HR, what are the most important skills then for HR leaders to focus on if they're going to be effective in their roles, in your opinion?
HR is interesting because I think for a long time, and this is still true in some organizations, management and leadership tend to look at HR as a specialty. HR management is just part of broader business management, and having the skills of a business manager is first and foremost. If you think about HR as some sort of a functional area in which the practice itself is sort of ensconced in something separate from the organization, which oftentimes is the way organizations look at it, then it doesn't become a practice that leaders and managers own. And so for me, while it is difficult to have non-HR people come into HR functions, it's imperative that HR functions understand the business. Goes back to my point about the goal line. If you understand that the goal line is a separation between winning and not winning, then the difference is that getting to the end zone is the only thing that matters. And so in HR, as much as there's specialty areas, managing payroll, managing employee benefits, compensation, there's all specializations within there. all of which have to support this goal of higher retention, all of which must support the business. And so the most important aspect of HR professionals today is making sure they understand the end zone. What is the business? What's the mission of the business? How do we compete? What do we compete better on? What do we need to get better at? Have the business conversations first. Once you've had the business conversations, then you go back and figure out what are the specialty areas that help support the business practices. And to the extent that you can sit at the table with all the leaders and talk about the end zone first, and then go back and figure out what does that mean about my recruiting aspects? What does it mean about our learning plan? What does it mean about how we compete from a compensation standpoint in the market? That's what's most critical. And I think it's hard because I think managers so look at HR as sort of a mystery box. I give that to HR because it's X, Y, or Z, and those three things all go to HR and let them figure that out. Business leaders, and that's a part of the book that's important, must own their outcomes. I don't own whether turnover happens in a particular unit, except for my own within HR. But each business leader needs to own it. Now, they can partner with HR because HR has certain specializations or practices or understandings that are very helpful to business leaders. But the business leader must own it. So their scorecard from an HR perspective is something that we may provide them from an HR perspective so they understand what's happening, what's working, and what's not. We can help them diagnose issues and help them understand what the plan is to fix those issues. But ultimately, business leaders have to take ownership of their teams. And those that are truly business leaders don't even think about it. It's a very natural process, and it's a very natural way in which they partner with HR. But if leaders delegate to HR, it doesn't work.
No, that makes total sense to me. And it's funny because we see a lot of scenarios in which, we work obviously with a lot of L&D teams and they're building these incredible and robust programs. And then no one wants them. No one does them, right? It's because they don't have those business partners and they're not thinking business first. They're sort of saying, oh, we need training, but it needs to be, I think it's right now it's a push and it needs to be a pull, right? Where you see the need and then therefore you build the programs to meet that need. Then of course everyone wants them because you have a clear reason for establishing whatever program you're creating because it specifically meets a business need.
And the learning space has many aspects, right? There's compliance and other types of training that are required. And, nobody likes that. It's a check the box exercise, maybe a necessary check the box exercise nonetheless, but it is sort of forced. But then there's, mandatory trainings for different skill development that are out there as well. And then there's, a range of other, what I'll call development oriented, whether it be, management training or otherwise that are helpful to people in their career. And those are optional, right? That's what's unfortunate. Some of that becomes optional when in fact, the great companies of the past and the current companies that do things well have a mix of development orientation that they figured out for their culture that is mandatory, but not mandatory in the sense that HR sends a memo around and says, you must take this training. It's mandatory in the sense that leadership gets together and says, for our X, Y, and Z reasons, we need to develop this amount of skill or capacity or capability in the organization. And they partner to put that together. But it's a business need first. And then there's a supporting mechanism, which is what's the right curriculum to develop or the right approach to take. Career development can be a mix of skill development learned somehow through some sort of a training program and career placement so that you get that right experience as well. And doing the combination and doing that well, that's a secret sauce that every organization has to figure out.
Amazing. Well, that's it for my questions. Unless Omar, do you have anything you want to add?
I think we're also at time, but I think it's fascinating. I think I love the approach. I love the approach of just choosing one thing. In general, it's a very Peter Thiel approach, and just focus on one thing. Like I have a board over there. Just I'm writing every week the one thing, and there is always one important thing for any level. So I think that's one thing. If you're focused on one thing, odds are that you will make it. And the second thing is if you, just focus on retention and then build a good plan, probably will excel. I wonder if you have data about kind of the good to great. So companies who have less than 5% retention, what are their business performance? So maybe that's my last question. If you found any evidence beyond logic works. If you found any evidence that like it actually the high performers of the market are the ones who retain less than like.
Yeah, the underpinnings of the book are a combination of case study plus research, and that research does have some industry-specific data. The broader kind of research efforts across industries are difficult, but we do have more industry-specific data that supports this. None of us, and any person you ask, there's not a person you'd ask that would disagree with the underpinnings of 5% or a number that would be in that range. The data supports that companies with higher retention perform better on all metrics. So yes, there is underpinning from a data perspective. I think the challenge that we have is that we get so focused on data for the industry that we lose the logic of why it matters. And what really matters to me underscores the importance of having a goal that you must hit. And we get so caught up in the industry data that says, well, in manufacturing, 8.4% is the industry average for turnover. Therefore, at 8.2, we're beating it. Not understanding that at 5%, you're substantially better than 8%. At that training dollar that you have to invest in onboarding people for that 3.4% difference now is invested in the people who have been in your team longer. You're going to have higher overall value in the organization from the resources you currently have. And that's what people have to understand is it's a choice in where you invest money. And if you invest it in the people you have and retain them, that's a lot cheaper and a lot higher ROI than if you have to go out and spend dollars on recruiting. Imagine the number of recruiters you could reduce, transform those dollars into learning or other aspects of the organization. And that's the other argument in the book is the trade-off of resource. If you have a fixed pie of resource in HR, if you don't need to spend it on recruiting, and you don't need to take your team's time and onboard new people into the organization, because that's the biggest cost of turnover. It's the onboarding of new people. That comes from the people in the organization today. That means whatever they're doing today, some percentage of their time is now going a different direction than what you'd like. And we never, ever take that into account. So there is good evidence that turnover at best-in-class organizations is lower. But the logic thread is the most critical aspect of it because none of us disagree with it, but we never get fully on board with focusing on all 10 of the aspects of it to ensure that it happens. And the investment dollars are a critical aspect of this because we forget how costly it is to spend money on recruiting, onboarding, skill development for new people, overall development for people that are coming into the organization, and the lost opportunity, the opportunity cost of having to spend time doing that work versus the work you'd like to have your team spending time on.
I love it. And on that note, I want to thank you for spending time with us. I hope this was super interesting, and I can't wait for the book to come out, and I hope you share it with us when it's fully published. And then we'll be sure to put it on the site. Awesome.